And good afternoon. Welcome. This is a beautiful Friday here in Little Rock, Arkansas. I hope that everyone's having a great day, and thank you so much for joining us. If you're following us on Facebook or YouTube, we so thank you for being with us. We have several who have joined already. A little late getting the invitation sent out this afternoon, so hopefully everyone will have an easy time finding us. James Hamilton is he's taken his place over there, and how you doing?
Oh, I could be seen, unfortunately, but I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad that you are. We've been talking about the church quite a bit the last couple of weeks, and today we're going to take a little break. I was asked a question yesterday afternoon, and it's one that people often ask, especially when something tragic happens in life. Something that we have no explanation for. Why does God let this happen? What's on God's mind? In fact, that's the exact question that was asked. What was God thinking? We have losses in this life. That's part of life. Why does God allow that to happen? We have tragedy. We have sickness and death. Why does God let that happen? We have violence in our society. James, if I were to ask you, what is the atheist's strongest argument against God? Or perhaps maybe the most prevalent. It's not strong really when you really examine it, but the most prevalent argument that they make against God, what would it be?
The existence of evil. If God is all powerful and God is all loving, how could he allow evil to exist?
That's it. And it's a question that many have tried to answer. The Bible does give us the answer to that question. And by studying the Scriptures, we can know why bad things happen. We can know why evil exists. We can know why sickness and death occur. We can know the answer to the question. Now, that doesn't mean that it makes it easy to bear. It doesn't mean that it's something that we can fully understand or comprehend, especially when we are in the crisis.
Yeah, I think it makes it really hard. It's when we're in it ourselves.
Yeah, because that's when, we're feeling it, right? And we are emotional beings. And so that makes it very difficult.
Well, in the case of Job, he's one of the best examples of that. And that's really what he was wanting to talk to God about. Why am I going through all this suffering and loss? I didn't do anything to deserve this.
Right. We don't have the answers to why a young child is taken from us.
And Job was not given the answer to the question either, by the way.
No, and we don't understand why tragedy strikes when it strikes. We don't understand, especially when you have a mother or father losing a child. That's one of the hardest things to experience.
Right, because that's contrary to the order of nature.
Right.
To have to suffer to that.
So why does God allow violence, suffering, and evil? And it's interesting that this was something that was posed to me yesterday afternoon, and then I was watching Jeff Asher last night. He was talking about this as well. And it is a question that is on a lot of folks' minds. And then, of course, you have what's going on in the news, the violence that is taking place. You have a lot of things happening that, where's God in all of this? Now, there was an article a few years ago that was put out in one of the mainstream newspapers. God is not fixing this. I don't know if you all remember that or not. God is not fixing this. And it was after one of the tragic shootings. It's a question that people ask. Why is God not fixing this? Why? We need to remember that God is going to fix it. It's going to happen.
Well, that's one of the problems of this question being asked. It's just taking a specific snapshot instead of taking into account everything, especially eternity, and that being the greater context. Because without that, you just take a snapshot of evil at this point, and you question about this specific evil. or then it becomes, well, any evil at all ever. Why does God allow that to happen? Because he has the power to put a stop to it immediately.
So that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. And as always, if you have a question, feel free to give us a call. Also, if you'd like to comment, you can comment on Facebook as you're following along. You can also comment by giving us a call, 1-855-568-1062. That is our telephone number. We are live right now at this moment, so give us a call, and we'll be glad to let you express your comment or ask your question. And we are, this program is devoted to searching the Scriptures to find out what they teach. We're searching for the truth, and the Scriptures, of course, contain the truth. All of the truth, by the way, as far as what God has revealed, it's there, and we can find every important answer to every important question, including this one, from a study of the Scriptures. Tragedy occurs. Tragedies happen. Whether it's from sickness, violence, accidents, natural disasters, there are all kinds of problems. Romans 8 and verse 22 says, "For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now." And it's going to continue to do that until Jesus comes back.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that groaning, part of that laboring, part of that pain is the sickness, the natural disasters, the accidents, and the violence. So the question is why? Why does God allow these things to happen? Why does God allow accidents to happen? You look, just for example, at just accidents. Are you aware that 1.36 people per day, that's 499 people in the state of Arkansas, last year, 2019, left their home and did not return home simply because they had an accident that day on the highway. This is just highway-related fatalities. 499. That's 1.36 people per day. They got up, got ready for work, they left home, and they never came back. They didn't get up that morning thinking that they were never going to come back home. They didn't awake and realize, hey, this is my last day. But it happened. Accidents is part of life. It's part of this world. There are, like I said, 499 fatal car crashes just last year. Accidents happen. 288 fatalities last year from earthquakes. You had 19 killed in a volcano, so your chances of being killed by a volcano aren't very high, but you never know. If you live in a volcanic region, I guess that's one of the things you can kind of know when to get out now with modern technology. But what about typhoons, hurricanes, tornadoes, natural disasters of other kinds? I mean, how many people are killed every year? 388 total worldwide deaths from typhoons, 17 hurricane fatalities. That seems rather low to me, but that's what the number was from last year. Floods, lightnings, storms. Just the other night when the storm came through, we had a large tree at the end of our house that was blown over, and I'm thankful to God that it blew. The wind was blowing from the other direction, because if it had blown the other way, it would have fallen on our house and on our living room where we were sitting at the time that it fell. Mm. So, you just, you never know, right? But of course, those are natural disasters. But what about wickedness, evil? Evil exists, ladies and gentlemen. I hate to tell you that, but it does. There are evil people in the world. You have 1999. I know that's going back a ways, but this was one of the first and most well-known, one of way too many school shootings. In Columbine, 13 people were killed. The shooters, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, Both died by suicide. And you think of all of the victims of that. You have the children who were killed, the innocent children who were killed, their parents, their family, their siblings. You have, don't forget, the parents of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. The life lived, and there's a picture on the screen, if you're watching, a picture of Sue Klebold, Dylan Klebold's mother. She's sitting there, in a cemetery. The pain, the heartache. Can you imagine? And it's not just, okay, my child was taken from me. Look at what my child did. That's hard. Why does evil exist? Remember just last year the Texas church shooting, and it's again not the first, nor probably not going to be the last. But you have tragedy that strikes. We have crime. I mean, you open up the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette every single day. You read the crime section, and what do you see?
Story about somebody who's died.
Every
Some
single
violent
day.
way.
And so, why does it exist? And, we even have just what's been going on in the news, this week. You have the man in Minneapolis, who was killed by a police officer.
Mm-hmm.
And, we can't know what's going on in the officer's mind, but I do know this. He wasn't following his training. He wasn't doing what he was supposed to do, and he did something that cost a man his life. And it was wrong, and he needs to be held accountable for it.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom line. And I hope that, one of the things about police officers especially, they not only, by the way, my son's a police officer, my brother-in-law's a state trooper, my brother is a sheriff. He's in the sheriff's department in Jefferson County. I've got a lot of police officers in my family. I know what their training is, and I know how they feel about this issue. And this guy needs to be, he needs to be held accountable for it. And it causes a black eye. I mean, it causes, okay, we'll talk about the violence in a moment, but just the perception that it does give. It is a representative. He was a representative of law enforcement. And even though 99.9% of police officers are, I'm guessing, maybe it's not 99.9, maybe it's 99. I will say this, the large majority of police officers are doing it for the right reason. They sure don't do it for the pay. I promise you. They don't do it because they get paid good. Most of them do it, like my brother-in-law, he does it because he loves to serve and protect people. That's the only reason why he does it. And he left a good job to do this. And you want to get the bad guys off the street. That's your whole motivation. You want to help and protect people. And one guy doing what he did, or 10 guys doing what they've done over the last 5 years, it causes a black eye on all law enforcement. In fact, you want to see a parallel. Think about this, and this is why our behavior, our actions as Christians is so important. If I do something that brings reproach upon the church, how does that cause the people in the world to view the church?
Yeah, a very bad way.
And do we understand that? Do we get it? Police officers need to understand that. When they do something that that causes the life of an innocent person to be taken, unjustifiably, and then you've got the spotlight shining on them, that's bad for everybody. Not only is it bad for their reputation, it puts them in grave danger.
Yep.
So you've got that, and then you've got also the response to that. I posted on Facebook yesterday, or maybe day before yesterday. Two wrongs don't make a right, and I've said that many times. And it's my mama told me that when I was a child. I've been taught that all my life. Two wrongs do not make a right. In fact, you know what happens when you respond to a wrong that's been done with another wrong?
You're overcome with evil. You have not overcome evil with good.
We talked about that Wednesday afternoon from Romans chapter 13.
Yeah.
We overcome evil with good, not evil with evil. Because when you respond in kind, you just complicate the issue. And not only are you doing wrong yourself, what you do then is you set in motion yet even more reaction, and it just makes things worse and worse and worse. And I've seen a lot of things on Twitter, that's attempting to justify rioting. Now, I'm all for peaceful demonstration. I'm all for getting people's attention, but you don't do it by violence. I'm sorry, that's just not the biblical way, the Christian way to respond to evil. And really, what is the Christian response to evil? How do we respond to it?
Well, first of all, we're not to repay evil for evil. We're not to be overcome with evil. And if we do something wrong to somebody because they've done wrong to us, then we are overcome with evil.
Yeah.
And we need to overcome evil with good. That's what we're to do.
So, you mentioned Job a few moments ago. Let me pull this back up. You think about Job 14 verse 1. Job said, "Our days are full of trouble," and that's true. I mean, we say, well, this happened, just last year. This happened last week. This happened, 3 years ago. We see this every 5 years. Yes, there are wicked people in the world, and they do wicked things. And it's our days are full of trouble. That's what Job said. This is not a new problem. Why do we have problems? Why do we have evil? Why? Well, it all began back in the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve sinned, what did they open up? What did they do?
Sin entered into the world. And then all the consequences of sin.
All the consequences of sin. We're sojourners and pilgrims through a world full of hardship and trouble, where evil and wickedness, evil men who do not regard the life of other people. There are people who are indeed racist. There are people who hate other people just because of the color of their skin. There are people like that. There are also people, they don't care about the color of your skin. They're just evil. They're just selfish. They want what they want. There are people who are vile and wicked and selfish, and they don't mind hurting somebody else to get what they want. There are people who are in positions of authority, and it's not just police officers either. They take full advantage of any authority that they have, and they use it to hurt people. That's a reality, ladies and gentlemen. And so we need to understand that. In fact, that's one of the things that we need to understand. All the trouble that we see, that should kind of get us thinking, There's got to be something better than this.
I think that's part of the design. There are a couple of things, I believe, as far as the difficulties of life in general, that God designed for us to have character that would be built up because of the hardship to overcome. But that did not happen. It was not necessary until sin entered into the world. And then he cursed the ground, so man would have to work harder to get food from the ground. And Romans chapter 8, verse 20 says that he subjected the creation to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. So the creation was subjected in hope.
Yeah.
You know, because tribulation produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. Back in chapter 5 of Romans, in verse 4. So it's a process that God, in His wisdom, understood was necessary. Now, that still doesn't speak to the very specific issue of evil men being allowed to do terrible things to innocent people, the ones that do not deserve it.
Mm-hmm.
But there's an answer for that as well.
Yeah. There is, but just the issue of suffering. And by the way, Romans chapter 8, okay, we are talking about innocent people in Romans 8. We're talking about Christians who are just trying to serve God and be faithful to Him. And Paul says that if children, then heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with Him. And this suffering is not just because of, natural disasters or calamities or tragedies or accidents. He's talking here about persecution because of their faith.
Yeah, suffering for righteousness' sake,
Yes.
like Peter said, or suffering as a Christian.
And notice in verse 18 what he says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that which shall be revealed in us." So yes, it points us and helps us and reminds us that there is something better.
But the snapshot approach, in asking this question, is only focusing on the present afflictions. And he says here, compared to eternity and the glory and the richness of our inheritance, what we can expect to inherit with Christ, is so great. I think when we're there, looking back about all the suffering in the totality of all the suffering in the world, it will be as nothing compared to what we enjoy with God forever.
So we've got.
So we have to be careful having this snapshot mentality and looking at the world, but that's what a lot of people do.
Yeah, and it's they live in the moment, and they respond not out of faith, not out of hope, but out of despair. They respond out of anger. They respond in kind. And I was always taught as a kid that, when you respond to someone who does you wrong by doing them wrong, all you do is become like them.
And it also, you're helping them to become even more of what they are,
right,
as well, which is wrong.
That's right. It emboldens them,
and
those like them.
It hardens them to remain that way and not learn.
Yeah.
If you were to respond with kindness, that might wake them up. It might be a new experience for them.
Right. Martin Luther King Jr. said this. He said, "You cannot drive out darkness with darkness. Only light can do that. You cannot drive out hate with hate. Only love can do that." He is a wise man.
And that's exactly what is true with good with evil. Mm-hmm. You cannot drive out evil with evil.
That's right.
You can only be with good.
Now, he also said, and I heard this on the news this morning, and people were making the point that, Mr. King understood something else too, that rioting is the result of, people who aren't being heard, and the only response they know to make is one of violence, to retaliate. And let me just say to you, friends, I understand that is a natural reaction. And when I say natural, I don't mean that in a good sense. I mean that actually in a bad sense. It is a reaction that is motivated from the flesh. It is motivated from carnality. It is motivated from ignorance of God and His way. It's a motivation that comes from the anger and the bitterness and the hatred that has developed in a person's heart. And it never works. James put it like this, that the wrath of man does not work the righteousness of God.
It can't.
It can't. It never has. I mean, I understand, because I understand human nature. I understand that people who aren't enlightened by truth and they don't, I understand how and why they respond the way that they respond. But that doesn't justify it.
Correct. I think that's another thing when people talk about understanding, doesn't necessarily mean they agree with it or approve of it.
Yeah, and certainly we should never approve of wrongdoing. Period. Never. Whoever does it. Listen, one of the things you hear me say all the time is truth is truth. I don't care who says it. You know what? Wrong is wrong. I don't care who does it.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter. If somebody does something wrong, then they are to be held accountable for it. So you made the point. In fact, last Wednesday when we were talking about government, government's job is not to be merciful.
No.
Government's job is to
Execute
exact
justice.
Mm-hmm. And when the government doesn't, then yeah, people are upset and they see it. I tell you what, they recognize that. At the same time, we recognize that we as people need to be merciful, and we need to try to understand every side, but that never says, okay, well, wrong is wrong, and we're going to let wrong stand, because it can't stand. We need to speak out. We need to say that's wrong. For example, in Minneapolis, and interesting, we were up in Minneapolis 2 years ago. It's been too long. My son lives in Minneapolis, and we're planning on going up there this spring, this summer. Don't know if that's going to happen or not now with all the stuff that's going on. But we were at that Target that was burned down. My son didn't live too far from there, and it's tragic what's happening. It's tragic what happened with the police officer doing what he did, and I'm glad he's arrested. I hope that they charge him with everything they can charge him with. At the same time, that doesn't justify what everybody is, that's causing the violence. Again, peaceful protest, fine, but violence, no. Can't justify it. Sorry, can't be justified. Why would God, who is all good and all loving and all knowing and all powerful, allow violence? That gets back to our original question. Do you think people simply, first of all, they don't understand who God is, and they don't understand God's purposes.
And they don't understand the nature of man.
Nope.
Either, I think when they're asking this question.
Now, I will say this. You know what? If I were a Calvinist, I'm going to have a problem explaining this.
Wouldn't the answer just be, well, God is God, and who are you to question him?
Well, yeah, but the answer is going to be, well, the reason why all this violence occurs is because God decreed it happen. God predetermined it happen. God planned this whole thing. God's the one that's causing this. That's the Calvinistic answer to the question.
And that's why Calvinism leads to atheism a lot of times.
Yep. But ignorance, rebellion, pride, those who reject God, the unbelieving critic asks this question, but they ask it out of unbelief and ignorance, rebellion, and pride. However, again, people do ask this question sincerely, wanting to know, why we got to let this happen to me and to my family, to my loved one. Why will God not stop this pain? Why won't he help me?
Well, you got an entire conversation of this in the book of Job. That is the meat of the book. But we have the beginning and the end of it as far as the narrative, where we know more than Job does because God revealed it to us. He did not reveal it to Job. But we all find ourselves oftentimes in the same situation as Job found himself. And that's why it's an important book to understand. And it's it's a book that's easy to misunderstand if we take statements out of context.
Mm-hmm. Again, thank everyone for joining us. We've got several comments. God's wrath is a righteous thing, absolutely. 2 Thessalonians 1:6-9. Yep, God's going to come back, and yes, all those who caused the suffering and the pain, they're going to be held accountable. Those who do not know God and that do not obey the gospel of Jesus Christ will be punished eternally. So they're going to get justice now. It's coming. Proverbs 26 and verses 4 and 5. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you become like him yourself. And that goes to the point of,
don't sink to his level.
Don't sink to his level. Yeah.
But then the second part says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes, which has to do with when
you just don't let it go.
When a person asks this question, there needs to be an answer. And that's exactly what happens in the beginning of the book of Job. God says, have you not considered my servant Job? And then Satan raises an issue. Well, he's only being faithful to you because you have treated him so well. You built a hedge around him and protected him from everything. That's the only reason he's favored you. If you just take all this stuff away, he'll curse you to your face.
Yeah.
Now, if God was to just destroy Satan right then and there, that would not have answered that issue. So, in order to prove Satan a liar, and it wasn't really to prove Satan a liar because he was already a liar and causing people to believe lies like Eve in the first temptation and ever since. But it was for the sake of the heavenly realm for God to be glorified in their presence, for this moral question to be answered. And the only way it could be done is for those things to be taken away from Job. And so it is it's a significant thing that we need to understand, and Job didn't actually understand that.
Yeah.
Never was told that we know
of. One thing that Job did learn, though, as another listener points out, I love Romans 8:28, good for comfort, which Romans 8:28 says, for all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose.
Yeah. And we love God because we know he first loved us.
And that's, yeah.
And that goes back to Romans 5. And it also goes to the rest of Romans 8.
Romans 8, yeah.
About how we're more than
ago.
conquerors through him who loved us. We're convinced of his love for us. How do we know that God loves us?
He gave his son.
That is the most unjust thing to happen in history. He's the most innocent person and the one who least deserved to die.
Yep.
And he died for us. We have sinned, and we actually are being shown mercy so that we do not receive what we do deserve, which is eternal separation from God when we have sinned.
It's interesting. God allowed wickedness to exist in the hearts and the minds of those people who unjustly crucified Jesus. Listen, he was falsely accused. They rushed to judgment because that's what they wanted to do. They hated him because he stood for what God sent him to stand for, the truth. And they crucified him because they did not truly believe God. They believed in their own way. And, Romans 8:28. Behold, therefore, the goodness and the severity of God. Romans 11:22. That's true. And again, God is going to hold everyone accountable. Another point of view. Here's another viewer makes the point. Another point of view would be that Mr. Floyd had not been. I don't know about that. I've also heard that it was someone else, and he was. I don't know about that. It is unfortunate. Tell you what, it's. I don't know about that. We'll have to see. I'm sure that things will be coming out later on, but there was no excuse, regardless of what the purpose was that the officers arrested him or detained him. Regardless, that officer was not following protocol, and he did something that cost a man his life because he wasn't following his training.
Oh, and it wasn't just, to me, it was not just a flash of anger and he lost his cool.
Right.
This was something that went on for minutes. I mean, a lot,
a
long time.
So that's and in fact, I told my grandson last night, I said, you know what? I said, here's the truth, okay? If you are doing what you ought to be doing, the chances of you being hurt by a police officer is very, very small. Both his mom and dad are police officers. So they may hurt him because as a young teenager, he's probably going to deserve a few beatings along the way. But it won't be. Hopefully, it won't be because he's out misbehaving in public and he's arrested, and that doesn't give that a cause to happen. But I just, and by the way, he's black. Okay, my grandson is black, and that's just, you've got to tell him, just you do what's right. You do what you're supposed to be doing. And anyway, all right. Appreciate all the comments. What a tragedy. And back to his death, being in police custody, it sparked outrage. And yes, it ought to spark outrage. I'm not for 1 second going to say it shouldn't spark outrage.
Well, because what that policeman did was outrageous. There's
Yes.
no other way to say it.
However, riots, now, when you start burning police precincts, and you're burning buildings, you're burning business, because they didn't do it. The business owners didn't do this. They shouldn't be having to pay for it. Building burns as riots erupt in Minneapolis, and of course that's spread to St. Joseph as well. Much riot damage caused by those who are from outside Minneapolis. And that's an interesting thing, by the way. That's what the governor of the state of Minnesota said this morning. The people who were causing the damage, they weren't from Minneapolis. Well, here's another thing. We do have to remember this. There are those in our society that like violence, and they're looking for reasons to be violent. What makes them any better than the original murderer? What makes them any better? I mean, it's wrong is wrong. I don't care who does it. I just make that point again.
Yeah, Proverbs 29:8 says, "Scoffers set a city aflame, but wise men turn away wrath."
Wise men turn. What passage is that again?
Proverbs 29:8.
Proverbs 29:8.
Yeah. Every time I read that, I think of Ferguson.
Mm-hmm.
But now I need to add Minneapolis to it as well. And Baltimore was another one.
Yep. And again, I understand people being upset, but wrath does not work the righteousness of God. And Paul said, "Be angry and do not sin."
Mm-hmm.
Matthew 5 and verse 45. Okay, it's true, my friend, that evil does exist. Jesus said it this way, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. God's giving opportunity for all to experience his goodness. But you know what? Some people are just evil.
For why God allows evil men to do evil things to innocent people, we need to remember that God is love. God is love.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he created man, he wanted to create a man, a being with free will who would choose to love him. And that really is what the book of Job is about.
Yeah.
As far as, does Job do this because of the benefits he gets from it, or does he do it out of love for God, his devotion to God, because God is God? And that is the answer. And he proved it by his life, and he glorified God by serving him in that way. Well, since God is love and he's created us with free will, that comes with the consequences of those who exercise their will to do wrong. And some time or another, every one of us has done that. So when you ask the question about those who who loot and burn, are they any better than the person who killed? In the case of the policeman, he killed the man that was already handcuffed. And we all are guilty of sin before God. And so we're all in that category.
We're all in the center boat.
So, yeah, we've all exercised our free will to choose wrong. But God, in his mercy, gives us a reason and a way through Jesus to demonstrate this selfless sacrifice and demonstrate his love for us. Like Romans 5 says, he gave his son. I mean, when you think about Jesus saying, a greater love has no man than this, to lay down his life for his friends. Well, what man would give his son's life for his best friend?
Right.
Wouldn't even do that. And so God's love is even greater. Romans 5 tells us, while we were yet sinners, while we were his enemies, he gave his son to die for us. And if that doesn't draw us to God and cause us to love God, then nothing will.
Right. And our need, by the way, our experiences should also draw us to God and recognize his love. Now, wickedness does exist. Violence, evil, suffering exist. The wicked, however, historically have suffered. God is going to bring justice. You know, it's interesting in 2 Peter chapter 2. The Apostle Peter reminds, he's talking about false teachers in the context, beginning in verse 4. If God did not spare the angels who sinned, what happened to those angels?
Well, they were put into Tartarus, actually.
Mm-hmm. Chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. He did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah. What does that tell you? What lessons should we learn from that?
God punishes sin. God hates sin. But he also delivered the righteous like Noah.
That's right. Now, he did. He allowed that to go on a long time because of his long suffering. In 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9, God is long suffering, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance.
And that means he suffers along with the evil.
That's right. And then you have turned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, marking them as an example of those who afterward would live ungodly. We've got precedents. Sometimes from a legal position, if you're a judge or a lawyer, when you're trying a case, you look for precedents, okay? What can we kind of go back and see, what the precedence is regarding this particular case and this issue? Well, we've got precedents that tells us that God is going to judge. He's going to hold accountable the wicked. And that's why when we were, James, Wednesday afternoon, when we were in Romans chapter 13, one of the things that Paul instructs us to do is to do good, return kindness for the evil that's done to us, and remember that vengeance belongs to the Lord. God says, I will repay.
Yeah, and he'll do it in his time, according to his wisdom. And that's what we need to remember. But he delivered the righteous, and that's what 2 Peter 2 talks about in the case of Lot. But he did destroy Sodom and Gomorrah.
You've got Sodom and Gomorrah. You've got Judah. He destroyed his own people because of their sin. Mm-hmm. He's going to hold you accountable. Edom, Egypt, Tyre, Sidon, Syria, Babylon, Jerusalem, Rome. All these nations fell because they turned away from God or they rejected God. You even have Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, in 2 Kings chapter 5. Ahab and Jezebel. Herod. We find it over and over and over again in Scripture. The wicked are going to suffer.
Sometimes in this life, sometimes not until this life is over.
But they're going to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to suffer the eternal condemnation if they do not repent. They're going to stand before God and give an account. But then you also have the righteous suffering. We see that throughout Scripture. It begins all the way back at the beginning in Genesis 4. You have a wicked man, Cain, who kills his brother, Abel. Abel was a man of faith.
Yeah, and Cain was jealous, and he hated him because his own works were evil when his brother's works were righteous. Mm-hmm. And he murdered him.
You've got the example of Job. We've already talked about him, and he's called to our attention in James chapter 5 and verse 11. Remember the patience of Job. He endured all of this. Of course, you had the natural disasters that occurred that took his family from him. But then you had his 3 friends who came and falsely accused him. That's hard. That's tough right there.
Yeah. But Satan is the one who did all those things. I mean, it's true. There was a whirlwind, the natural disaster. Raiders, for a couple of those cases, stole his livestock. But, the whirlwind came and destroyed all his children, all of them, all at once. Mm-hmm. And the devil, he, as vicious as he was, he timed everything to have the greatest emotional impact on him, because one servant comes, and right after that another one comes, and right after that another comes, and the news gets worse and worse.
It pours, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it just got worse and worse to where, and he, how much he loved his children, because he prayed for them and offered sacrifice for them every single day. Mm-hmm. If perhaps they have cursed God in their hearts.
Then Joseph, Genesis chapter 37, sold into slavery by his own brothers.
And then, when he was tempted by Potiphar's wife, he suffered because he did what was right.
He suffered because, when he told his father and his mother and his brothers about the dreams that he was having, that created jealousy within them. Of course, his father gave him that coat of many colors. That also engendered jealousy.
Yeah.
He was the favorite. And, a lot of lessons that you can learn from Joseph. But like you say, then after they sell him into slavery, he goes into Egypt, and he rises up in Potiphar's house, and becomes head over all things.
Yeah, the cream rises to the top.
Why was he so blessed?
Well, he was practicing the principles that the Lord has established, and so he had favor in the sight of Potiphar. Now, Potiphar saw that the Lord blessed him. Because Joseph was such an effective worker.
Potiphar understood that he was being blessed because
by the Lord.
of Joseph.
Yeah. Kind of like Laban, because Jacob was there, back in Genesis. But then, his wife makes this accusation after she tempts him many, many days in a row, every single day. She wouldn't leave Joseph alone, and then one day when they were the only two that were alone in the house, she took the occasion to grab him and his garment, and he literally fled. And then she said, "Oh, here's a woman scorned." Just shows this as the evidence. He tried to take me, and so he just believed his wife and didn't even think about giving Joseph a chance to explain anything. He just had him thrown into prison, and so. You can imagine Joseph thinking, "Here, I'm doing everything right, and now I'm stuck in prison."
Yeah,
and feel sorry for himself.
Yeah.
But he doesn't do that.
He doesn't.
He still
what a great example, Joseph.
Yeah, but the reason
in so many ways,
because you were talking about how it's important, that no matter how we're being treated, if we do what's right, well, that's how Joseph got the favor in the sight of Potiphar. It's how he got favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Proverbs 3
before Pharaoh.
Yeah, Proverbs chapter 3 verse 4 talks about how, or verse 3, mercy and truth. Write they're to be on the tablet of your heart. Mercy and truth, that combination. And if you do that, the next verse 4 says, and so you'll find favor and high esteem in the sight of God and man.
That's right.
And so if you want to be respected by people, you be fair, you go according to truth, but you also have to show kindness, compassion, consideration, mercy. And it's that combination that gives us favor in the sight of other people.
You got the example of Paul, who Paul was an individual that he had done a lot of wrong. Although he thought he was serving God, he thought he was doing right, but he had Christians put to death. I mean, he voted for their death.
Yeah.
He had them arrested. He hauled them to prison, and he voted that they be put to death.
Well, in one of the passages, it says he compelled them to blaspheme.
Yeah.
And to me, that would be the hardest thing for him to live down, would be that.
But then when he became a Christian, of course, he did everything he could to serve the Lord, and he suffered greatly because of that.
Well, you reap what you sow, and usually more than you sow. He certainly did. Jacob did too. You reap more than you sow.
Yep. Of course, you've already mentioned the suffering of Jesus. How did he respond? We talked about this a little bit on Wednesday afternoon as well. How did Jesus respond to his being falsely accused, mistreated? I know I've been falsely accused of things before, nothing major, of course, but I've been falsely accused, and I don't like that.
That's about one of the worst things I've ever experienced. And one of the times for me was a policeman pulled me over, accused me of speeding, and I wasn't. I know I wasn't. And that just burned me up. But you know what I learned from that? To think of what Jesus went through. To be falsely accused. Now, I know more what it means to be falsely accused than I would have otherwise in that very specific experience. So I'm actually thankful that I've had that experience, even though it was painful at the time. I can look back on it and see that I've learned something from it, and it's made my relationship with Jesus that much more meaningful to understand that he was willing to go through that for me.
He suffered like, of course, none of us ever suffered. Job suffered like none of us hopefully will ever suffer. Paul suffered like none of us hopefully will ever suffer. Jesus suffered like hopefully none of us will ever have to suffer. I mean, that, can you imagine? It's not just, of course, the cross. That's the pinnacle. But throughout his life, the misrepresentation, the false accusations, the hatred that was directed towards him, the mistreatment, the scourging. Anyone who's ever watched The Passion, you see a true representation of what scourging was.
Yeah.
And how do you go through all of that? You haven't done anything wrong at all. Sinless, the sinless Son of God. He did all of it for us. And the suffering of Jesus, that we need to stop. We need to slow down. And we need to think more about Jesus and focus on him and on what he would have us to do, and develop the character of Jesus in our lives. And how we need that in our country right now.
Well, in the case of Jesus, though, he allowed evil to put Jesus to death. If he had his own son put to death, what was that for? Jesus actually, if you look at Mark 14, in the version of his prayer at Gethsemane, he says, "All things are possible for you. Take this cup from me." That's exactly what people are saying. Well, God is all powerful. He's able to prevent me from having to go through this.
Yeah, and Jesus knew everything that was going to happen to him. John tells us.
That's right.
So
he knew it was necessary, and that's why he prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." And God's will is always right, and it brought about our salvation.
Isaiah 53, verse 5, "But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed." So suffering, the righteous suffer. Wickedness, again, it does exist. It doesn't come from God. Wickedness does not come from God. And we're going to have to move on here. We've got just a couple of minutes left, and we're going to draw our study today to a close. But I want to quickly just answer the question, why does God allow evil? Sin occurs. Sin exists. God, in his sovereignty, allows men to have free will. The result of free will is that men choose to reject God, which is sin, which then plummets man into a wicked environment. And, the founders of this country, James, they believed strongly that freedom could only exist as long as men were morally upright in accordance with God's word.
Yeah, because if we're enslaved to our own passions, we're not free.
Freedom
and
is
we're going to make
follow.
bad choices.
And there is no way. There's no way for a free society to exist when men are selfish, when men are prideful, when men are hateful, when men are filled with racism and bigotry and strife and envy and jealousy, when those characteristics fill the hearts of people, when selfishness is the primary motivation and greed, a society is going to crumble. You certainly can't be free. You've got to have somebody to come in with an iron hand and say, this is how you got to behave.
No, if people can't control themselves, then they're going to have to be controlled by some external force.
Right. Everything that God made was good, and all the laws were made for our good. However, because of sin, everything changed. Humanity became subject to the sweat, and toil, and pain, and thorns, and death. Sin changed everything, and it was our sin. It wasn't God who made that happen.
Right.
It was man's sin.
And then after the flood, even more changed as far as the weather and the changes in the. That's what causes storms and all these kinds of things. So there's all kinds of consequences that are indirect because of a previous sin that affects our world today, our environment.
And entropy began. I mean, this world is. I mean, things are getting worse. The world is running down. Things will get worse. It's cyclical, but things do get worse. Why did Adam and Eve suffer? When we make foolish decisions, when we make bad choices, it causes us pain.
Yeah, but when other people make foolish decisions, it can also cause us pain. Children suffer the consequences of a bad parents. I mean, if the father gambles away all he earns in the week, they all go hungry.
For every sin, there is negative consequences.
Yeah, for the individual a lot of times, but also for others.
Right. We reap what we sow, as one of our viewers listened, and to the point that you were making, we're connected to each other, and thus the potential to be injured by others' decisions.
Yeah, that's the consequences of other people's sins.
So my choice to do evil doesn't just affect me. Nobody sins in a vacuum. Much pain in this world is collateral damage simply because people are wicked.
Well, you think of that concept of victimless crime, like prostitution or gambling and stuff like that. There's no such thing.
No, there is no such thing.
Drugs. Yeah.
There is no such thing as victimless crime. So we are connected, and thus the potential to be injured by others. And so innocents have always suffered. People are killed on highways every day by drunk and careless drivers. Slander and gossip ruins reputations and lives, and corrupt police officers do hurt people. That has always been the case. People in authority abusing their authority. Now, let me make this point, and we're going to, again, have to wind this down. Again, appreciate all the comments and those who are watching. Just because there are wicked people does not mean everybody is wicked. Let's be careful not to make generalized judgments based on the actions of a few. Listen, it's just as wrong to falsely judge a group of people because of the actions of a few as it is to overlook the sinful actions of the few. We're wrong either way. So let us be careful not to judge the group by the actions of one or two. We tried to make that point at the beginning, but I want to reemphasize that. Children suffer because of the parents. Divorce. By the way, let me tell you, my friend, much of the reason why we have the problem in this country that we have today is because of the breakdown of the family. That's the source of most of our problems. The family nucleus, the family structure is broken down, and because of that, we have people who don't know what it's like to be loved and cared for, and they're not raised in a family where mom and dad cares for them. They're raised with anger and bitterness in their hearts. The breakdown of the family lies at the heart of most of our problems. Of course, that's not a new thing, but that's the truth. And parents and children suffer together because of sin. We do not sin in a vacuum. So, all right, I'll tell you what, we're going to have to stop. Hope that everyone's had a good day, and I hope that our discussion this afternoon has been encouraging. Appreciate your comments and your questions today. Yes, one of our viewers said, "Practice the fruit of the Spirit." Amen. That's how. Let me close with this point. What would our communities be like if people bore the fruit of the Spirit?
Well, it'd be wonderful.
What if everyone in Minneapolis bore the fruit of the Spirit? You know what? What we saw the last couple of days would have never happened. There wouldn't have been a police officer abusing his authority and unjustifiably doing something that cost a man his life. It wouldn't have happened. If he had had love for that person in his heart, it wouldn't have happened.
No.
And if we have that kind of love and joy and peace and long suffering and patience, these things wouldn't happen. So just think, if all of us were truly following the Lord's will, what a wonderful place. But the problem is that too many people don't.
Well, strive for being with God forever. We'll be that way in a wonderful place.
Yeah, and we are certainly vulnerable to the inhumanity of humanity, and people are wicked.
Don't take our eyes off the goal.
That's right. Keep your eyes focused on the Lord and just do what's right. Always try to do what's right. Don't walk around with a chip on your shoulder waiting to be offended and waiting to be made angry. Anger does not work the righteousness of God. So appreciate everyone for being with us today. Lord willing, we'll be back Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock. Sunday morning, we will be assembling here at the building at 10 a.m. We're going to have one service again this upcoming Lord's Day, and we're going to have another lesson on the Church of Christ, God's called out people. Right? That's what the word church means. So we've talked about the body, we've talked about the kingdom, we've talked about the bride, we've talked about the flock, we've talked about the church being the temple of God. This Sunday we're going to talk about the church. What that means as being called out. Called out of what? What does that imply? We're to be different. So, Lord willing, we'll all join ourselves together here Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock. Again, thank you for being with us, and until then, may God bless you. Hope that you have a great rest of the day. You call